Greetings. We've discussed 5 central concepts of philosophy and 3 general areas of philosophy as we've worked together to create a common language and knowledge base for this course. The purpose of this lecture is to present 4 different perspectives that characterize how we can view life and education. These 4 perspectives, which we will call life/education views, continue to provide a common language and a common knowledge base for our discussions. We apply the 5 central concepts of philosophy and the 3 primary areas of philosophy in each of the views. That's why we covered the central concepts first and then the 3 areas. Now we're building upon that knowledge, and we use those as we apply these to our life/education views. Before we get started, though, I'd like to share an article with you, a short one that you have in your course documents, and it's entitled A Tribute to Jesse Stewart. I'm going to cut away to the overhead here for just a moment and pull this down so you can read this. Okay, this Jesse Stewart was a teacher who retired some time ago, and he was generally perceived as an excellent teacher. And at the time he retired, a number of people wrote tributes to him, and this is one of those written by a fellow by the name of J.R. LeMaster. And if you're interested, you can see that Jesse Stewart's book is also available if you want to search for it to talk about what he really stood for. But here's what's important about this is what J.R. LeMaster said. It says, "My contention here is that Jesse Stewart developed a coherent philosophy of education based upon a coherent philosophy of life. I am further contending that any educator who does not do that is wasting his time as well as the time of his students because he has nothing to teach." Think about that for just a minute. The operative words here are coherent philosophy of life and a coherent philosophy of education. What we're going to talk about now is the different views, how we can see life, but also we're going to ask some questions about those, and we're going to address coherence, in the spirit of Jesse Stewart, if you will. Before we do that, though, a couple of other background kinds of things. It's my personal opinion, and you can argue with me on this, and you certainly don't have to agree with me, but it's my opinion that everyone has some form of view of life and education. In fact, we've had this discussion before in this class about if someone really had what we would consider to be no view, would that in itself be a view? Now, I don't want to go there. We could argue and discuss that probably until we're blue in the face. But I think that it's probably more important to think not about the presence or absence of a life view, but the coherence and the consistency of life and education views. And so there are 3 important questions that kind of come up as we think through that. The first is, why is it important to have a well-thought-out view? Okay. Let me give you an example that one of my colleagues, Ed Walker, uses in his classes about the story of Nasruddin, and it comes to us from a Sufi proverb. Sufi proverbs go back through a long, long time, so to speak, and they kind of come from the Islamic tradition, and they're similar in terms of morals to a number of biblical parables that we know of. But anyway, this is kind of a contemporary, it's been contemporized, if you will. But anyway, this fellow Nasruddin is a judge in a trial. And in a particular trial, the prosecuting attorney gives a summation at the end of the evidence portion of the trial, indicating that the defendant is guilty. Wow, this summation is so compelling and so persuasive that Nasruddin, the judge, stands behind the bench and says, "You're right." Well, Nasruddin sat back down again, and then the defense attorney provided an excellent closing statement for the defense. This statement was equally compelling and equally persuasive, and at the conclusion of the statement, Nasruddin stands up and says, "You guessed it, you're right." Well, a person in the gallery stood up at that point and says, "Judge, you can't have it both ways." And you can probably see this coming, but Nasrudin then stands and says, "You're right." Well, we, like Nasrudin, I believe, will lack direction if we do not have well thought out views of life and education. Corollary question, then the second question might be, is it possible not to have a life/education view? I talked about this for just a second. So I've already suggested, I think it's improbable that that would be the case. The existence of a view, as I said, is probably not an all or none phenomenon. I would guess that views probably sit somewhere along a continuum, from on one side being not well thought out to the other side being well thought out, and we all kind of fall somewhere in there between. I don't think it's just a question of presence or absence. So my contention is that we have to spend time making sure that we think about our life and education views to assure that they're well thought out if they're ever going to be coherent. Which is the third question then. Should life and education views be coherent? Well, according to Jesse Stewart, in the tribute to Jesse Stewart, they really need to be, or at least consistent with one another. I think it would be very difficult for them not to be at least somewhat aligned, because, let's say for instance, for example, that I believe in the principles of equality, justice, and liberty in life. Shouldn't these principles also be an important part of what I do in my classes? If there are major inconsistencies between our life and our education views, I think we could be seen as phony, or at the very least, living a charade at some point. What would you think of someone who acted very, very differently in school than they did outside of school? Would you question what their views are, if they're really coherent or not? We'll be exploring each of those three questions that I've just raised more deeply in some of our assignments throughout the semester. But my purpose now is to concentrate on introducing the 4 ways we can review life and education and encourage you to begin thinking about how they can be applied. Let's get a little bit more specific. What are life/education views? Life education views are ways we look at life and education that help us look deeper at our core beliefs and values. As I've already suggested, we apply the concepts of philosophy in the 3 areas of philosophy as we continually refine our life views and our education views, and they reflect our core beliefs and values. Now, I think you can see that there's probably a circular, I would call it a symbiotic relationship between our life and education views and our core beliefs and values, because they both kind of affect one another. They influence each other to at least, I think, probably a large degree anyway. The question that comes up is, should our core beliefs and values ever change as our life and education views evolve? Because those may change somewhat over time. I would suggest probably not. Not substantially anyway. Jim Collins is a researcher from the University of Colorado, and kind of like my work with Peter Senge, I've had the chance to spend a lot of time with Jim Collins' work. And one of the things that Jim Collins has done is he studied effective businesses, effective organizations, and effective leaders. And one of the things that he's found in his research is that effective, high-performing businesses and high-performing leaders are very clear about 2 things. First of all, the things that should never change in their own work and in the things that they stand for, and that would be their core values and beliefs. And also how clear about things that should change, and that would be policies and practices in the way we do things. So I would suggest to you that I think that our basic values and beliefs are probably going to remain fairly constant, but other things around them, the way we do things, can certainly change. And so as we think about life views and we think about how beliefs influence life views, I think the beliefs and values are probably going to have a very consistent effect on how life views evolve. Okay, well, let's get into the life views for a minute. I'm going to show you what they are first. I'm going to cut away here for just a second. Oops, there they are. Okay, there are 4 different life/education views. First of all, there's the essentialist view. And we'll spend some time talking about that. Secondly, there's the experimental view. The third view is reconstructionist view. And finally, our last view that we'll look at is what we call the existential view. The 4 life views. And we're going to spend some time. I'm going to introduce those to you and kind of give you some of the nuts and bolts of what these are. But as I get into the specifics, also note that there's a lot of specific information about each of those life/education views in your course documents link in Blackboard in the course documents tab there. So I would encourage you to kind of look at that background information as well. And a lot of that background information is what I'm going to be talking about. But heck, maybe you'd rather just read it than to listen to me. But I'll leave that choice to you. Hopefully you'll listen to this anyway, for sure. Let's start with the essentialist life education view. This particular view is characterized by a simple view of life. An essentialist sees life simply, and her or his life view tends to be centered on his or her own experience. Life is not complicated to a true essentialist. Life is seen as I know it. Essentialists have a very set or concrete view of life. Essentialists tend to think in either-or patterns, and there's very little or no gray area, particularly about things that they have in terms of absolutes, absolute beliefs, absolute values, etc. In fact, essentialists are what we would call white-knuckled about absolutes. And by white-knuckled, we're talking about hanging on to those so tightly for dear life and for long periods of time that they never want to let go of those. In fact, they can get very emotional when someone tries to question them on those absolutes. Essentialists tend not to be as reflective as some of the other views. It doesn't mean they're not reflective, but they're not quite as reflective usually as people in some of the other views, because why question or discuss what we already know for sure? Time orientation is to the past, and often they want to go back to an earlier time in life when things were more simple. Essentialists believe strongly in order and structure, and essentialists are preservers and are very slow to change. Doesn't mean they won't change, but they're slow to change. They're hanging on to the past oftentimes. Because tradition is very important, and it's very important to maintain the status quo. As I said, not necessarily opposed to all change, but you'd have to really convince an essentialist that there's a need for change. As far as education goes, essentialists believe that learning is difficult, and it is the student's responsibility to learn. Education should be based on basics, the 3 R's, and there is a set body of information that students should know. Essentialists often rely on drills or repetitive worksheets to set information in the minds of students. Teachers must have tight control on learning, both in terms of content and methodology. The teacher is the center of instruction. Learning is focused on cognition, not the affective or psychological domains of the teaching. You might know some essentialists. I probably have some essentialist tenets myself. And, I don't know, you folks most of you probably aren't old enough to remember this, but there used to be a show on television. I don't watch a lot of television, but it used to be one, maybe you see reruns of it now, called All in the Family. And one of the main characters' name was Archie Bunker. And in my mind, Archie was a great example of an essentialist. Life was simple to Archie. They just had to get back to the basics. They had to just live the way it was 50 years ago, and all the problems would be taken care of in our world. Another potential example, I have a brother-in-law that I think is a good example of being an essentialist. And even though I'm not really much of an essentialist, I have some essentialist qualities, he questions me quite a bit. He believes things. He picks a lot of things up off the internet and believes them as fact, so to speak. And it's hard to dissuade him from that. But we have some great conversations, and I think as we get into life views, that the key is that we can have some excellent conversations, and we can really stretch ourselves and learn as we visit and interact with those who may have a different life view than our own. And so there's certainly a lot of value in those kinds of discussions. But you can probably think of essentialists in your life, and perhaps you, like I, would have, like me, would have some essentialist tendencies as well. Okay, that's essentialism. The second view is the experimental life/education view. And this is characterized by a desire to know. Experimentalists believe that we know primarily through science. Results of scientific inquiry provide the best basis for knowledge and for our learning. We learn through reasoning and through logic. Experimentalists are a little skeptical about the truth. To an essentialist, to contrast for just a moment, truth is kind of in the palm of their hand. They have that truth most often. To an experimentalist, truth, they're a little skeptical about truth. They believe that searching for truth is demanded of everyone and that scientific inquiry is the method by which we discover truth. And the reason that they would be a little skeptical about truth is that, according to experimentalists, truth changes with the developments and new insights from science. An experimentalist, for instance, would not let an article on the internet, a television program, or a single news article determine truth for them. To an experimentalist, change is inevitable, and change is the one constant that we can count on. We have to learn to adapt to change, and we have to learn not to fear change, according to an experimentalist point of view. Experimentalists demonstrate a natural dislike for absolutes. In fact, they loathe absolutes. So an experimentalist and an essentialist sometimes can clash over issues like this. An essentialist believes and holds on to those absolutes with white-knuckledness, if there is such a word, I just made one up. And also then the experimentalist loathes absolutes. Experimentalists also believe that risks are necessary if we are to learn, grow, and develop new insights. Risks should be taken, though, in light of reason and logic. They won't jump into just any risk, but will take risks when they seem logical and when they are logical. Experimentalists are future-oriented. As far as education is concerned, education should be related to the interests of students, according to experimentalists. Instruction should rely on and build upon prior knowledge. Learning through problem solving should replace rote thinking, and inquiry should permeate instruction. The role of the teacher is less directive and more that of a facilitator to an experimentalist. And the curriculum should be broad-based and provide many opportunities for students to explore and enrich themselves. The teacher helps students connect subject matter across subject matter areas, and that's the teacher's job. Education to an experimentalist should be life itself, rather than practice or preparation for living. And the school should encourage cooperation rather than competition from an experimentalist perspective. And the classroom then should become a democratic place so that students can practice democratic principles. I have a friend who's a true experimentalist. In fact, probably one of the brightest people that I've ever had the pleasure of knowing. And used to work with him. And he would never make a decision until he had enough data. And he would look at multiple sources of data before he would make a decision. In fact, I used to kid this person and say, you really have analysis paralysis, because this person would analyze and analyze and analyze and analyze, and I'd say, it's time to make a decision. Well, no, I need to collect this much more information before I can do it. So you can think of some experimentalists. You might have some experimentalist tendencies yourself. So that's the second life view, would be the experimentalist life view. The third life view is really, it's Reconstructionist life education view, and it represents a special branch of experimentalism. Hence, there's going to be a lot of similarities between Reconstructionism and experimentalism, but there are some differences, and I'm going to point those out to you in just a second. Generally speaking, Reconstructionists believe in the same principles of scientific inquiry, logic, and risk as noted in the experimentalist perspective. Reconstructionist thinking builds upon experimentalism, however. Reconstructionists are more willing to take risks than someone who's an experimentalist. So, if you're really a Reconstructionist, you're kind of out there on the risk scale a little bit more. And I would identify at least three attributes that separate Reconstructionists from experimentalists. First, Reconstructionists believe that social change is desired and demanded, and that there is an urge to speed up the process of change. Social change is something that is not something that just happens. It's our purpose on the planet to promote social change, according to Reconstructionists. Reconstructionists believe that action is imperative. So it kind of goes back to the experimentalists again. Oops, I got to turn the light on. Hang on a minute. Yeah, I learned my lesson. We're saving money in terms of lights out every once in a while. But a Reconstructionist, again, suggests that action is imperative. And it kind of goes back to the experimentalist and says, okay, so you've done all the research and you've got all the data you've got. It's time to act. It's time to act now. In my example, when I was talking about my friend that was the experimentalist, I was kind of acting like a Reconstructionist there for me too. It's time to act, time to move on, for sure. With respect to education, many of the experimentalist ideas are also relevant and respected by Reconstructionists. Education's primary goal is to promote a clearly thought out program for reform. We have to teach students to be stewards of our planet, which is another thing that kind of distinguishes the Reconstructionist stewardship. Students need to understand problems and issues that threaten civilized society, like injustice, greed, war, and environmental pollution. And teachers need to be the role models of change. So, in a nutshell, Reconstructionism is kind of taking experimentalism another step with the idea that social change and stewardship are very, very important and have to happen. Examples of Reconstructionists, can you think of some? Don't know this, but as I think of Martin Luther King Jr. as a Reconstructionist. Would be in my mind anyway. I also had the pleasure of working with a special education director once that was a true Reconstructionist. This person was ready to tear everything down and build it back up again in the day. The other thing you have to know is that when I was back in college in Chicago years and years ago, it was the days of the hippies. And I think we were all Reconstructionists at one time or another because we were going to burn everything down and build everything back up again, for sure. Okay, so that's the Reconstructionist life view. The last life/education view is the existential view. This one is probably the most different from the other views that we're going to see. The existentialist life and education view provides perspectives where they're kind of different than what we discussed thus far. To an existentialist, used to be able to say that. To an existentialist, truth is subjective. It's individually perceived and determined. Now think about that for a minute. Truth is subjective. It's individually perceived and defined. That is probably 180 degrees from what we would find with an essentialist. And it's a little different also than what we would define truth as from an experimental or Reconstructionist point of view. Another important thing about existentialism is intuition and the heart are equally as important as logic in determining truth. So from an experimental and to a large degree from Reconstructionist point of view, data drives decisions. Research drives decisions. To an existentialist, yeah, those things are okay, but intuition and what I believe, what I think, is going to be just as important in terms of making decisions. Existentialists do not insist on explaining or logically determining reasons for life's experiences. We don't have to explain and understand everything. Things just happen from an existentialist point of view. Bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people. We just don't explain it. That's just the way it is. Life has its ups and downs. We just need to learn to control our responses from an existentialist point of view. Existentialists have a general sense of anxiety and dread most often. And probably they feel forlorn because in the final analysis, we are alone. The existentialist is present-oriented because what we know is what is happening right now. What happened yesterday is gone, and what happens tomorrow is not known. And so, no wonder we're into right here and now. We might feel a little bit forlorn, and for sure, tomorrow is only an illusion to an existentialist. We face free will and free choice. We can choose and act on our will, and we need to take control of our thinking and our actions according to existential thinking. Existentialists also believe that we should experience life as fully as possible. We have to live large, since today is really all we have. As far as education is concerned, the curriculum should be based on real existence and provide for freedom and choice, awakening experiences for each student. It should also be both academic and participatory, allowing for ample engagement in the arts, physical activities, and other exploratory activities. The teacher, the job of the teacher is to initiate thinking about fundamentals, but his or her major responsibility is to originate possibilities for each student to pursue her or his own growth. Teaching methods must allow for maximum self-expression and choice. So that's existentialism, is the fourth area. Do you know any existentialists? You have some of those traits yourself? I would like to suggest to you that none of these life views in and of themselves are either right or wrong. They're just different views. One other thing I would suggest to you is that you may not have a pure life view. In other words, you may not fit directly into any of those four categories, and that's okay. And, I certainly don't. A lot of people don't. But there's probably some preferences for you where you're going to fall. On the other side of that coin, though, I don't think it's possible to have a little bit of all of them. I don't think it's possible to be a fourth essentialist, a fourth experimentalist, a fourth reconstructionist, and a fourth existentialist. Because, frankly, as you can see, there's some things in those life views that are inconsistent and really incompatible, some of the things with other life views. And so I don't think that's possible either. Well, we're going to spend some time with you, helping you explore your life and education views in this course. And I guess I would encourage you to kind of try on each of those views and see kind of where you think what fits you the best. We have some assignments coming up in the near future where we're going to allow you to really expand on them. Well, that should do it for this lecture then. Thank you, and take care, everyone. Okay.